Greetings, it is I, Titus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the 2nd edition of AD&D. Well, where we last left off, we were talking about random encounters, well, encounters in general, but we talked about random encounters. Today I'm going to talk about random encounter tables. So there's many ways as there are dice combinations to make random encounter tables. You could have something simple like a d6 where you roll and there's one of 6 things that could show up. Or you could have it as complex as you wanted. You could have percentile, which is also altered by the time of day, which is also altered by the weather, which is also altered and modified by the terrain you're in. And make it incredibly complex and convoluted, whatever you feel is appropriate to the types of encounters you're having. But we're going to go over 2 types today that are very simple. Not simple, basic. They're the traditional ones. The 2d10 method and the percentile table. So the 2d10 is effectively the 2 to 20 table. It has 19 spaces, where 2 and 20 are the most rare, and 9 to 13 are the most common. Effectively, you're going to use the frequency of the monsters you had before and place them on the table where it is appropriate to that frequency. Again, like we talked before, you can modify frequency depending on the situation, but once you figure out the frequency of this monster in this area, you can know where to place it on this entire table. If it's at a 2 or a 20, it's very rare. Now, effectively, I'm going to come up with a list of creatures I want in this area. Traditionally, I'm going to aim for that 19, but I might be above or below it. If I'm below it, I could always double up entries. Basically, make something a little bit more common in an area to make it fill up those spaces. If I have too many, more than 19, I could either drop some of these creatures out, or I could double up these creatures. Effectively have it that 2 creatures to a space, I just have to figure out which one it would be if I would roll that. Each one would have a slightly less percentile chance then, technically, but that's the way that you're going to figure it out at that point. You're going to use these percentiles to your advantage in that way. Now, the percentile chart is a little different in the way it works. Effectively, it has from 1 to 100 spaces. Easy to say there. Now, because of that, it also in a way is it's a little bit more flexible in the way you arrange frequency in this case. Frequency, you can bend it a little bit more to your will, but it does make it a little bit more complex in a way. So I come up with my list of creatures just the same, and I arrange them by the frequency that is appropriate to the creature / appropriate to the world I'm building. Common, uncommon, rare, very rare. Then I look at the percentile that it would be from 1 to 100. Okay, the 70% common, 30% common, etc. for very rare and rare. What I would do is I would take the number of common things I have, divide that into the 70, and that's how much percentage I should have for each of these creatures to encounter them here. Now, if I have an extra percentile, I will throw it somewhere, especially if I have to round in some way. I can adjust this chart as I feel it's necessary. If I feel like one creature is especially more common than the other, I could increase this, I could decrease other things' numbers, but I could use this to basically create a rarity chart all the way down for all my commons, uncommons, rares, and very rares. And again, depending on the numbers of these things, I might have to adapt them appropriately. I might have to siphon off some very rare, because if I have a couple of very rare creatures, more than the percentage gives me because of this entire formula, well, then I'm going to have to eat up some percentiles from somewhere else, maybe from common. But regardless, this is a good way of then, it's a little more dynamic and flexible because I have more options. But then again, I have to think a lot more and do a lot more math. Now, dungeon encounter tables that you might build work a little bit differently. Traditionally, when I mailed a dungeon encounter level, I aim to have it reflect a level of the dungeon, quite literally, but also the level of the players that are encountering things in that level of the dungeon. There you go. So if I'm on the first level, effectively I'm looking at first level things. Now granted, I could start the dungeon off at a higher level and then just use the dungeon levels to represent those increases in it. Effectively, the farther down it goes, the more experienced the character should be, the more difficult things they should fight. Traditionally, all these creatures should be able to survive on the same level because they're the same power. You won't have a lot of things of weaker level or higher level because they wouldn't unbalance the nature of that level. That's why they're all going to kind of be the same. That's at least the basic logic behind it. Now, traditionally, you're going to not fight monsters 2 levels higher than you or 1 level lower than you in this area. You might, but those are the maximum. So 2 levels higher, 1 level lower would be the maximum if I'm fighting something other than any of the other normal traditional creatures that I'd be fighting against for the level that I'm at. Beyond there, it shouldn't really be within the scope, and it doesn't make sense for these things with the logic we've been speaking about for fitting in here. Again, these things are going to be at lower numbers. They're going to be rarer because, you know, if they're weaker, they're trying to hide here and not get in trouble. And if they're stronger, they would be overpowering everything and everything might be turning against them. So they also might not be in as great number. So you can see the numbers on the chart should reflect this, and the different charts should be reflected separately. Almost that you're having a chart per level to reflect your character's levels. So character level, dungeon level, and encounter level almost mashed together and gel together in a way. Again, because maybe your characters are higher level, you might have the dungeon level start out higher? Even though it's like the first level, it would be the 3rd rank dungeon level. Now, as I said, sometimes you might get stronger or weaker creatures in these areas, but that is entirely going to be up to the way you're building it. The fact is that you should take a look at every creature that you're going to be including in your dungeon and get a feel for them and how they might appropriately fit within this dungeon that you're going to be using for random encounters. You do want them to fit within the feeling of the dungeon if you're going to be using them. If they don't fit, if they don't feel appropriate, if they're not level appropriate, they're not going to be fitting necessarily. Now here is where the bit of the random chance comes in when it comes to, of course, dungeon levels. I can choose to use my 220 chart if I have it that 2 goes to the lower chart and 20 goes to the higher chart. This is a way that I can have those higher and lower encounters with creatures in my level with just a roll of it rather than trying to include them into my normal chart. Because then if I roll a 2, I go to the lower chart, which is already, I've said, a lot less frequent. 20, go to a higher chart, again, higher frequency. And if I only allow that next 20 to go to the next higher up chart one more time, then, you know, maximum of 2 higher, and it could be especially rare things that are that strong showing up here, would make a lot more sense. It works just the same if I'm using percentile, except I go from 1 to 3 for lower chart and 98 to 100 for higher chart in this case. So I'm doing the top ends also in this case for the very little tippy top of each of these numbers to figure out if I'm switching charts. And you only will start moving charts in one direction if you start moving charts. You may have to re-roll, especially if you get a lot of ridiculous. I roll like 98, 99, 100 in that order. I'll only go up 2 charts the last time to re-roll. Now, wilderness counter tables are intrinsically different. There is no limiting factor on the level of things you're fighting when it comes to wilderness. In fact, wildernesses can be much more dangerous in a lot of places and can be much more deadly. You can have much more powerful things that you would be not able to fight against and would definitely kill off your players. Here becomes one of the intrinsic problems when it comes to low-level players. First-level players will die in a traditional wilderness you're just doing. So what can I do about this? Well, if it's in a civilized land, perhaps guards have been eliminating a lot more of the powerful monsters, so the chances of encountering something that would overwhelm them are much more slim, and they could always attempt to run away from it. Traditionally, a lot of things that are remaining that they might get into fight with are the weaker things that have managed to run and hide a lot more when it comes to the guards. So when you're looking to the wilderness, you're not only looking to the creatures appropriate to the terrain you're in, because you have to choose an appropriate terrain and then make it according to whatever the terrain is, you also have to look to the level of civilization, because the level of civilization will alter the types of encounters you have in this wilderness area too. Both are huge factors into what you're going to encounter. So that's it for today. I talked about building random encounter charts. I talked about the 2 main methods which are easiest to use. The 2d10/2 to 20 method and the percentile method. Both of these are great ways to build random encounter tables, but you can build any type of encounter table you deem is appropriate. Whatever you think is appropriate to the world you're building. If it fits, go ahead and use it. It could be as crazy or as simple as you think is necessary. Then I talked about two types of encounter tables, the dungeon encounter table and the wilderness encounter table. The dungeon one, which is more often than not based upon each level of the dungeon as you descend deep into it, that it will become more and more difficult as you go down because you should be getting stronger as you go down. Dungeon level should reflect counter level, which shouldn't reflect character level. Traditionally, this isn't always perfect. There are fluctuations between the levels, but you always have to make sure it fits within a certain purview. Then I talked about the wilderness encounters, which could be just deadly outright because there is no cap on the level, the difficulty of whatever you're facing against. And it is important to note, which I didn't earlier, that there is a table in the book that compares experience of a monster you're fighting to the level it would be, and that helps especially for the dungeon level one when you're considering it there. Important one to note that. But going back to the wilderness encounters, just to summarize it a little more, look at the level of civilization. More civilized, the more some of these really dangerous beasts have been eliminated, the rarer they might become, or the less likely you are to add one to your chart. Makes it easier for your players to travel these places. When they travel to those deep wildernesses away from civilization, then yeah, who knows what they're going to find there. That red dragon could show up and breathe fire on them. Definitely might happen. While if you're around a kingdom, the chances of that happening are slim to none. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you would say, anything you think I left out, please leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's just for the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, link description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.